Imagine being laughed at, mocked, and treated like a joke just because you're a janitor. That's exactly what happened to Samuel, a quiet black janitor who was dared to play the piano at a CEO's birthday party. Everyone expected him to embarrass himself, but when his fingers touched the keys, the room froze. By the time he finished, even the billionaire CEO, known for his iron heart, was wiping tears from his eyes. This is the unforgettable story of the janitor who silenced the world with his music. Go on. Show us what you've got, janitor. The voice cut through the grand corporate hall like a whip, followed by a burst of laughter. The chandeliers glittered above. The marble floor reflected the light like water, and the long tables were covered with sparkling glasses and gold-rimmed plates. It was the CEO's birthday party, and the richest people in the city were in attendance. They were dressed in tuxedos and gowns, sipping champagne, and whispering about their latest deals and investments. And in the middle of it all stood Samuel, a middle-aged black janitor, wearing his gray jumpsuit and carrying his mop, blending into the background like furniture. He was not part of the celebration. He was the one cleaning up after it. For most of the night, nobody even noticed him. To them, he was invisible, just another worker making sure their perfect party stayed spotless. But then one of the young employees, emboldened by a little too much wine, spotted him. He looked at Samuel, then at the massive Steinway grand piano sitting on the stage at the center of the hall. A mischievous grin spread across his face. "Hey, everyone," the young man shouted, raising his glass. "I think our janitor here should give us a little show. What do you say?" The crowd chuckled. Some smirked. Others shook their heads, amused. "Play us a tune, janitor." Another voice chimed in. "Let's see what you've got." The suggestion spread like wildfire. Soon, people were whispering, giggling, clapping their hands together mockingly. "Yes, yes, let him play," they cheered. It was meant to be a joke. A cruel one. The idea of a janitor, someone who scrubbed floors for a living, sitting at a grand piano in front of millionaires was ridiculous to them. They expected him to fumble, to hit wrong notes, to embarrass himself. And oh, how they would laugh. Samuel froze where he stood. His hands tightened around the mop handle. His heart thudded inside his chest. He didn't ask for this attention. He hated the spotlight. He just wanted to finish his work quietly and go home. But now, dozens of eyes were on him. "Go on," someone jeered. "Don't be shy. Or are you scared?" That word, scared, hit Samuel harder than the laughter. He had been called many things in his life. Poor, useless, invisible. But scared? That wasn't him. He wasn't a man who backed down. Not after everything life had thrown at him. So slowly, with an expression that betrayed nothing, he leaned his mop against the wall. The laughter grew louder. People nudged each other, whispering, "Oh, this will be good. He's really going to do it." Samuel began walking across the hall. His old work boots made soft, steady sounds against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted slightly, watching him with smirks, expecting a comedy act. To them, he wasn't a man with dignity. He was tonight's entertainment. But Samuel's eyes weren't on the crowd. They were fixed on the piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a grand, polished Steinway, gleaming under the spotlight, its lid open wide like a bird's wings. And for Samuel, it wasn't just an instrument. It was a memory. He hadn't touched a piano in years. Not since the days when he still dreamed of being a musician. Before life had crushed those dreams under bills, responsibility, and endless nights of hard labor. Before he became the janitor. As he approached the stage, whispers filled the room. This is going to be hilarious. He probably doesn't even know how to sit on the bench properly. Someone record this. The CEO himself, Mr. Reynolds, sat at the head of the hall, his face unreadable. He didn't stop the mocking voices. He simply raised an eyebrow, curious to see how the janitor would embarrass himself. Samuel stepped onto the stage. His rough hands brushed against the smooth wood of the piano bench as he sat down. He didn't smile. He didn't look nervous. He just looked calm. For a moment, he did nothing. His callous fingers hovered above the ivory keys, but didn't press down. He closed his eyes, as though searching for something deep inside himself. And in that stillness, the hall began to quiet. The laughter faded. The whispers softened. Even the waiters carrying trays of wine glasses paused, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Samuel took a deep breath. In his mind, he wasn't a janitor anymore. He wasn't standing in a room full of people who thought he was nothing. He was young again, sitting in his church choir, where music once lifted his soul, sitting in smoky jazz bars, where he played his heart out for small crowds who cheered with genuine joy, sitting beside his late wife, who used to tell him, "Samuel, your music heals people." He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "For you, Mary." Then his fingers touched the keys. The first sound that came out wasn't clumsy. It wasn't broken. It wasn't wrong. It was soft, delicate, and beautiful. A single note, followed by another, then another, weaving together into a melody that was full of soul. The crowd froze. Their smirks vanished. Their laughter died instantly. This wasn't what they expected. Not at all. Instead of comedy, they were witnessing something else. Something powerful. The janitor, the man they mocked, was about to change everything with the music flowing from his fingertips. Samuel sat at the piano again, months after the gala that had forever changed his life. But this time, the setting was different. He was no longer in a grand hall filled with wealthy executives. He wasn't in the company building either. He was at a small community center, surrounded by children. The kids sat cross-legged on the floor, their wide eyes glued to his fingers as they danced gracefully across the keys. The melody was soft, full of warmth, carrying a story of pain, struggle, and triumph. When the last note faded, the children erupted into applause. Their laughter and joy filled the room. Samuel smiled, his chest swelling with something far greater than pride. Purpose. The transformation of a janitor. Not long ago, Samuel had been the janitor, the man who worked late at night, sweeping floors no one noticed, carrying out trash bins no one thanked him for. He was invisible. But one night, when arrogance tried to make a fool of him, when laughter tried to break his spirit, Samuel turned the tables. With nothing more than his music, he shifted the room, melted the coldest heart in the building, and awakened a company, perhaps even a world, to the truth that greatness often hides in unexpected places. That single moment had reshaped his life. The CEO's legacy, too. Back at the corporation, things had changed permanently. Mr. Reynolds, once known as a ruthless and untouchable CEO, began implementing new programs to highlight employees' hidden talents. Art exhibits, music showcases, storytelling nights. Suddenly, the company wasn't just about profit margins. It was about people. And every time he was asked what inspired the transformation, Reynolds had only one answer: a janitor who reminded me of my humanity. Samuel's journey forward. Samuel, meanwhile, began his studies at the conservatory. At first, he felt out of place among young students who had been trained since childhood. They knew the technical terms, the theory, the language of music. Samuel only had his heart and his hands. But what he lacked in theory, he made up for in soul. Professors were stunned by his ability to make music feel alive. "You don't just play notes," one instructor told him. "You make us feel the story inside them." It wasn't long before Samuel began performing at recitals, then concerts. His story spread with him. Audiences weren't just there for music. They were there for the miracle of the janitor who had risen from the shadows. A message that echoed. More importantly, Samuel never let fame or recognition erase where he came from. He continued to volunteer at the community center, teaching children the piano for free. He often reminded them, "You may feel small today. You may feel unseen. But remember, your gift is not defined by what others think of you. It's defined by what you do with it." Children listened, their eyes wide, believing him, because Samuel wasn't just telling a story, he was a story. The ripple beyond the company. The gala incident had gone viral, yes, but its impact stretched beyond clicks and headlines. Other companies began adopting similar programs, spotlighting the hidden talents of their employees. Society began talking more about dignity, respect, and the unseen gifts of ordinary workers. People started asking themselves, what gift are we overlooking? Who around us might be carrying greatness in silence? All of this because one janitor had been asked to play a piano as a cruel joke, and instead turned it into the greatest lesson of all, the final conversation. One evening, long after Samuel's life had blossomed into something unimaginable, Mr. Reynolds invited him for dinner at his home. They sat in the study, where a grand piano stood in the corner. "You've changed my company, Samuel," Reynolds said, his voice softer than the world had ever heard. "But more importantly, you've changed me." Samuel looked at the man who once sat above him like a giant. Now, they sat as equals, two men brought together by the power of music and truth. Reynolds leaned back with a wistful smile. "My wife would have loved your music. I like to think she was listening that night, too." Samuel's eyes misted. He placed a hand on the piano. "Then every note I play from here on, I'll dedicate to her, and to anyone who's ever felt invisible." The legacy of the janitor. Years later, people would tell the story again and again. They'd say, "Did you hear about the janitor who made the CEO cry? He went from cleaning floors to filling concert halls. He proved that greatness can come from anywhere." And children who grew up hearing his name would learn an unforgettable lesson. Never judge a person by their uniform, their title, or their silence. Because sometimes hidden behind the quietest lives are the loudest symphonies. The outro for YouTube. Studio microphone narrator voice. And that's the story of Samuel, the black janitor who was mocked, who was underestimated, but who turned humiliation into triumph. The man who sat at a piano and with his music not only silenced a room, but softened the heart of a billionaire. So the next time you pass by someone you think is just a janitor or just a waitress or just a driver, remember this. You might be looking at a hidden genius, a person whose gift could move the world, if only given a chance. Because greatness isn't about titles, money, or power. It's about heart. And Samuel, he had the heart of a maestro all along. The morning after the gala felt almost unreal to Samuel. He woke up in his small, modest apartment on the edge of town, the sound of traffic drifting in from outside. For a brief moment, he thought maybe it had all been a dream. The piano, the applause, the CEO's tears, the unbelievable offer. But then his phone buzzed, and buzzed again, and again, the flood of messages. At first, Samuel thought there must have been some mistake. His old phone, usually silent except for an occasional call from his sister or a text about an extra cleaning shift, was now lit up with notifications. Messages poured in from people he hadn't spoken to in years. "Samuel, I saw the video. That was incredible. You're trending online, do you know that? My cousin was at the party. He said you made the CEO cry. Is that true?" Samuel rubbed his eyes, blinking at the screen. Trending? Online? He scrolled further and froze. Clips from last night's gala were everywhere, on social media, on news blogs, even on the company's official page. Someone had recorded the exact moment Samuel played, the exact moment Reynolds broke down in tears, and the exact moment the CEO declared Samuel would never again be just a janitor. Within hours, millions of people had seen it. The company transformed. When Samuel finally arrived at the skyscraper where he had once quietly cleaned floors, the atmosphere was entirely different. Security guards who used to barely glance at him now smiled and nodded. Employees stopped him in the lobby to shake his hand. Some even asked for autographs, as if overnight Samuel had become a celebrity. But the biggest change wasn't just in how they treated him. It was in how they treated each other. That night had exposed something deep. Employees whispered about how humbling it was to see their boss cry, to see the invisible janitor become the star. Suddenly, people seemed more careful with their words, more respectful toward the cafeteria staff, the cleaners, the drivers. The hierarchy that once felt like an iron wall had cracked, just a little, and Samuel had been the one to swing the first hammer. An unlikely mentor. True to his word, Mr. Reynolds called Samuel into his office. But this time, Samuel didn't enter with a mop or cleaning supplies. He entered as someone seen, valued, and respected. The office was grand. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, walls lined with books and art. Samuel had been in there before to empty trash bins, but never like this. Never as a guest. Reynolds stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned with a smile Samuel had never seen before, warm, almost fatherly. "Samuel," he began, "last night wasn't just about music. It was about truth. You reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago." He motioned for Samuel to sit. The CEO explained that his late wife had loved the piano. She used to play every evening, filling their home with music. After she passed away, he buried himself in work, shutting away that part of his life. That's why Samuel's music had struck him so deeply. It wasn't just beautiful. It resurrected memories Reynolds thought he had lost forever. Samuel listened in silence, his chest heavy with emotion. For the first time, he realized it wasn't just talent that had changed his fate. It was connection. The world takes notice. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, "From janitor to maestro, the night a CEO wept." Hidden talent shines at gala. Who is Samuel, the musical janitor? CEO breaks down in tears as employee plays piano. Journalists requested interviews. Music schools reached out, offering Samuel spots in their programs. Even talk shows wanted him to appear, to play for their audiences, to share his story. For Samuel, who had lived most of his life unseen, it was overwhelming. Fame was never something he'd asked for, but now it seemed the world was asking for him. The ripple effect. Back at the company, a ripple effect had begun. Employees started forming music and art clubs, something unheard of before in the corporate culture. Charity concerts were organized, and Samuel was invited to headline them. Funds raised went toward scholarships for underprivileged kids who wanted to pursue the arts, kids who might have ended up invisible, just like Samuel had been. The gala had become more than a single night. It was a movement, and Samuel found himself at the center of it. The emotional visit. One afternoon, as Samuel left the building, he was stopped by a young janitor who had just started working there. The boy looked nervous, clutching his mop like a lifeline. "Sir," he stammered, "I just wanted to say thank you. People used to ignore me too. But after what you did, they look at me differently. You gave me hope." Samuel's heart swelled. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and smiled. "Never let anyone tell you your worth. Your gift might be hidden today, but when the time is right, the world will see it." Samuel's inner conflict. But with the recognition came fear. Samuel wasn't sure if he was ready to leave the only life he'd ever known. Could he really step into the world of music full time? What if he wasn't good enough? At night, alone in his apartment, he sometimes doubted himself. He'd whisper, maybe they're just being nice, maybe it was just one good performance. Yet every time he sat at the piano again, the doubts melted away. The music reminded him that his gift was real, that his journey wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The CEO's guidance. Reynolds seemed to sense Samuel's fear. One day, after listening to Samuel play in the office, he said gently, "Samuel, do you know the difference between a janitor and a maestro? Not talent, not opportunity, just courage. One day, you'll have to decide if you're brave enough to step fully into who you are meant to be. And when that day comes, I'll be standing behind you." Those words sank deep into Samuel's heart. The dawn of a new life. Weeks later, Samuel officially signed his scholarship papers. He would begin studying music at one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. The same man who had once carried buckets and scrubbed floors was now preparing to carry sheet music and step into practice rooms where he truly belonged. As he left the building that day, walking past rows of employees who smiled and clapped for him, Samuel realized something profound. It wasn't just his life that had changed. He had changed theirs. The applause thundered to the grand hall, echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. People were still on their feet, clapping furiously, some whistling, others wiping tears as they tried to compose themselves. And yet, even amidst the noise, one man remained utterly still. At the head table, Mr. Jonathan Reynolds, the billionaire CEO, known for his ruthless deals and icy demeanor, sat motionless. His hands rested on the table, his chin slightly tilted down, his eyes locked on Samuel. The storm of applause around him seemed not to exist. Samuel felt that gaze. It wasn't cold or calculating like it had been earlier in the night. No, this time it was heavy, almost vulnerable. He shifted nervously on the piano bench, unsure whether to stand, bow, or simply leave. Then, like a ripple cutting through the noise, Mr. Reynolds slowly rose to his feet. The room fell silent. The applause died instantly. It was as though someone had flipped a switch. Every guest knew what it meant when Reynolds stood. He wasn't a man of wasted gestures. His presence alone commanded attention, and now all eyes followed him. The CEO took a slow step forward, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the floor. He didn't rush. He never did. Each step felt deliberate, each one carrying weight. The silence grew deeper. Guests held their breath. Even the waiters froze in place, their trays half lowered. And Samuel? His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the ovation that had just ended. He had no idea what was about to happen. A rare vulnerability. Mr. Reynolds stopped just a few feet from Samuel. For a long moment, he simply stared at him, as though trying to gather the right words. His face, usually stern and unreadable, now looked softened. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, but unlike anything the crowd had ever heard from him before. Samuel, the way he said the name was enough to make the guests lean forward. Not the janitor. Not you. He said his name with respect. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat, and when he continued, his voice carried an unusual heaviness. I haven't heard that song in over 30 years. A murmur rippled through the guests. 30 years? What did he mean? Samuel blinked, his hand still resting lightly on the piano keys. He hadn't chosen the piece for any reason other than instinct. It was simply the song that had lived inside him since childhood. The CEO's story. Mr. Reynolds' gaze grew distant, as though he wasn't standing in a grand hall anymore, but somewhere far away. My mother used to play it, he said softly. Every night, when I was a boy, she sat at our old piano and played that exact melody. I'd fall asleep to it. It was the last song she ever played before she. He trailed off. His jaw tightened. The guests held their breath, sensing the weight of what was unsaid, before she passed. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. For a moment, no one moved. No one even dared to blink. This was Jonathan Reynolds, the man known for cutting down competitors without a second thought, the man whose empire had been built on steel and stone, now standing vulnerable before his employees, his peers, and his guests, admitting to a wound he had never spoken of, the power of a song. Mr. Reynolds turned his eyes back to Samuel, and his voice wavered for just a second. When you played that melody, it was like she was here again. For the first time in decades, I felt her presence. He paused, letting out a shaky breath. I thought I had buried that part of myself. I thought I had built walls high enough to keep the pain out. But your music, it broke through. It reminded me of who I was before all of this. He gestured vaguely to the room, the wealth, the power, the empire he had built. It reminded me of the boy who just wanted to listen to his mother's piano. Samuel sat frozen, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected this. He had only wanted to share his music, to express himself. But now, he realized he had reached into the heart of a man who seemed unreachable. The unthinkable happens. The guests were stunned. Never in their lives had they seen Mr. Reynolds open up this way. To hear him admit to grief, to longing, to vulnerability, it was like watching a mountain bend in the wind. Then, something even more unthinkable happened. The billionaire CEO stepped closer to the janitor. And with everyone watching, Jonathan Reynolds extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice cracked on the words. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you." The room gasped. This was a man who rarely thanked anyone, not even his board of directors. But here he was, offering gratitude to the janitor. Samuel hesitated for just a moment before rising slowly to his feet. His hand trembled as he reached out and shook Reynolds's. The CEO gripped it firmly, his eyes locking with Samuel's in a silent acknowledgement. "You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever." The crowd responds. The crowd could no longer contain themselves. Applause erupted again, louder than before, but now it was different. This wasn't just admiration for Samuel's playing. This was admiration for the courage it took for both men, one to play, and the other to open his heart. People stood again, clapping, cheering. Some even wept openly, their tears flowing freely now that the most powerful man in the room had given them permission to feel. For once, no one cared about appearances. No one cared about status. In that hall, for those precious few minutes, they were all just human. The CEO's promise. As the applause slowly quieted, Mr. Reynolds held up a hand. The room fell silent once more. He turned back to Samuel. "You've reminded me tonight that greatness doesn't come from titles or wealth. It comes from the courage to share your gift, no matter who you are or where you come from." He looked around the hall, his gaze sweeping over his guests. "I think we all needed that reminder." Then, back to Samuel, he said words no one expected to hear. "You will never again be just a janitor in my company. From this day forward, you're something much greater." Gasps echoed across the hall. What did he mean? A promotion? A new role? The guests whispered in disbelief. Samuel's eyes widened, his breath catching in his chest. Whatever the CEO meant, he knew one thing. His life was about to change forever. The moment etched in history. The image of that moment. Samuel standing at the piano, hand in hand with the CEO, while the crowd watched in reverent silence, would be remembered for years to come. It was more than just a performance. It was a revelation. The janitor who had once been invisible was now unforgettable. The final notes of Samuel's song lingered in the air like a whispered prayer, refusing to vanish. The room, once filled with laughter, chatter, and clinking glasses, was now utterly silent. It wasn't the heavy silence of awkwardness. It was a delicate, sacred silence that comes when people are afraid to breathe too loudly, terrified of breaking the spell. Samuel's hands finally lifted from the keys. His chest rose and fell as he drew in a deep breath, slowly opening his eyes. For a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far, if maybe he had played too long, too passionately. The faces before him were unreadable. But then, something extraordinary happened. From laughter to stillness. Only an hour ago, the same crowd had been restless and mocking. When Samuel was asked to play, guests smirked, rolled their eyes, and exchanged knowing looks. They expected clumsy notes, maybe a silly tune, something to reinforce their belief that a janitor could never belong in their world. But now those same faces were transformed. Jaws hung slightly open. Eyes glistened under the chandelier light. People who once scoffed at him were leaning forward in their seats, clutching the edges of their chairs like children desperate for the story not to end. The laughter that had once echoed to the hall had been replaced with something far more powerful. Awe. The waiters' forgotten duties. In the corner, the waiters stood frozen. Their trays of drinks sat untouched on side tables. Not a single waiter moved to refill glasses, collect empty plates, or tidy napkins. Why? Because they were no longer waiters. They were an audience. One young server, who had been silently wiping down glasses just minutes before, now stood with tears streaking down his cheeks. He didn't care if the guests noticed. In fact, for once, the social hierarchy of the room seemed to vanish completely. No one was a servant. No one was a master. Everyone was just human, united under the spell of Samuel's music. The guests looked at each other. Something remarkable began to happen. As the guests slowly regained awareness of themselves, they began glancing around the room, almost sheepishly, as if waking from a dream. And in those glances, they saw something they had never expected to see in each other: vulnerability. The woman in diamonds, once so composed and proud, was dabbing at her mascara with a handkerchief. The hard-faced manager stood stiffly, trying to hide that his hands trembled. Even the young woman who had laughed the loudest earlier sat red-eyed, her chin quivering. They looked at each other and realized it wasn't just them. Everyone had been moved. Everyone had been broken open. For the first time, the room wasn't divided into the powerful and the powerless. It was filled with equals, all undone by the same music. Respect replaces arrogance. When Samuel first sat at the piano, people looked at him with smirks, seeing only his janitor's uniform. Now, those same eyes followed him with something entirely different: respect. It wasn't the kind of respect bought with money or demanded with status. This was deeper. This was the kind of respect you feel for someone who has touched your soul, someone who has given you a gift that no wealth can buy. The guests weren't just looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at an artist, a master. And in that shift, Samuel's position in the room changed forever. The CEO's tearful gaze. At the head of the room sat Mr. Reynolds, the CEO, the man everyone feared, the man who had built his empire on ruthlessness, who never once allowed his emotions to show. But now, his face was wet with tears. He didn't hide them. He didn't bark orders at anyone to look away. He simply sat there, staring at Samuel with an expression that was impossible to mistake: gratitude. For Reynolds, this wasn't just a performance. It was redemption. Samuel had played a melody that reached into the deepest wound of his life and offered healing. No amount of money could have bought that moment. No amount of power could have forced it. And in the CEO's softened eyes, every guest saw the truth. Something extraordinary had happened. A shared energy. Slowly, the silence of the room began to change. It wasn't broken by chatter, but by the gentle, almost hesitant sound of applause. One pair of hands clapped softly. Then another. Then another. And soon, the hall filled with thunderous applause. Not the polite kind people give at formal events, but the raw, uncontrollable clapping of people who have just experienced something unforgettable. Some guests even stood, rising to their feet without realizing it, pulled upward by the sheer force of what they had witnessed. The applause rolled to the hall like a wave, shaking the walls, echoing off the high ceilings. Samuel sat there, stunned. He hadn't played for recognition. He hadn't played for applause. He had played because the music demanded to be played. And yet, here he was, receiving the kind of ovation most performers only dream of. The transformation complete. The transformation of the crowd was undeniable. They had entered the evening as people of wealth and status, laughing at the idea of a janitor daring to step into their world. But now, they were leaving performance as something else entirely, humbled, softened, changed. The music had peeled away their layers of arrogance and revealed something they thought they had lost: their humanity. And at the center of it all was Samuel, the man they once mocked, now standing taller than anyone else in the room. Samuel's quiet strength. As the applause roared on, Samuel bowed his head slightly, humbled. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to being seen. But in that moment, he realized something powerful. People hadn't just heard his music. They had felt it, and that was enough. He didn't need their applause to know he had given them something real. The respect shining in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. The janitor, no more. In that instant, Samuel was no longer defined by his uniform, his mop, or his broom. He wasn't just a janitor. To the crowd, to the CEO, and even himself, he was something more. He was proof that greatness doesn't come from titles or wealth. It comes from the courage to share your gift with the world. And the crowd, transformed by his music, would never forget it. The final notes of Samuel's song lingered in the air like a whispered prayer, refusing to vanish. The room, once filled with laughter, chatter, and clinking glasses, was now utterly silent. It wasn't the heavy silence of awkwardness. It was a delicate, sacred silence that comes when people are afraid to breathe too loudly, terrified of breaking the spell. Samuel's hands finally lifted from the keys. His chest rose and fell as he drew in a deep breath, slowly opening his eyes. For a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far, if maybe he had played too long, too passionately. The faces before him were unreadable. But then, something extraordinary happened. From laughter to stillness. Only an hour ago, the same crowd had been restless and mocking. When Samuel was asked to play, guests smirked, rolled their eyes, and exchanged knowing looks. They expected clumsy notes, maybe a silly tune, something to reinforce their belief that a janitor could never belong in their world. But now those same faces were transformed. Jaws hung slightly open. Eyes glistened under the chandelier light. People who once scoffed at him were leaning forward in their seats, clutching the edges of their chairs like children desperate for the story not to end. The laughter that had once echoed to the hall had been replaced with something far more powerful: awe. The waiters' forgotten duties. In the corner, the waiters stood frozen. Their trays of drinks sat untouched on side tables. Not a single waiter moved to refill glasses, collect empty plates, or tidy napkins. Why? Because they were no longer waiters. They were an audience. One young server, who had been silently wiping down glasses just minutes before, now stood with tears streaking down his cheeks. He didn't care if the guests noticed. In fact, for once, the social hierarchy of the room seemed to vanish completely. No one was a servant. No one was a master. Everyone was just human, united under the spell of Samuel's music. The guests looked at each other. Something remarkable began to happen. As the guests slowly regained awareness of themselves, they began glancing around the room, almost sheepishly, as if waking from a dream. And in those glances, they saw something they had never expected to see in each other: vulnerability. The woman in diamonds, once so composed and proud, was dabbing at her mascara with a handkerchief. The hard-faced manager stood stiffly, trying to hide that his hands trembled. Even the young woman who had laughed the loudest earlier sat red-eyed, her chin quivering. They looked at each other and realized it wasn't just them. Everyone had been moved. Everyone had been broken open. For the first time, the room wasn't divided into the powerful and the powerless. It was filled with equals, all undone by the same music. Respect replaces arrogance. When Samuel first sat at the piano, people looked at him with smirks, seeing only his janitor's uniform. Now, those same eyes followed him with something entirely different: respect. It wasn't the kind of respect bought with money or demanded with status. This was deeper. This was the kind of respect you feel for someone who has touched your soul, someone who has given you a gift that no wealth can buy. The guests weren't just looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at an artist, a master. And in that shift, Samuel's position in the room changed forever. The CEO's tearful gaze. At the head of the room sat Mr. Reynolds, the CEO, the man everyone feared, the man who had built his empire on ruthlessness, who never once allowed his emotions to show. But now, his face was wet with tears. He didn't hide them. He didn't bark orders at anyone to look away. He simply sat there, staring at Samuel with an expression that was impossible to mistake: gratitude. For Reynolds, this wasn't just a performance. It was redemption. Samuel had played a melody that reached into the deepest wound of his life and offered healing. No amount of money could have bought that moment. No amount of power could have forced it. And in the CEO's softened eyes, every guest saw the truth. Something extraordinary had happened. A shared energy. Slowly, the silence of the room began to change. It wasn't broken by chatter, but by the gentle, almost hesitant sound of applause. One pair of hands clapped softly. Then another. And soon, the hall filled with thunderous applause. Not the polite kind people give at formal events, but the raw, uncontrollable clapping of people who have just experienced something unforgettable. Some guests even stood, rising to their feet without realizing it, pulled upward by the sheer force of what they had witnessed. The applause rolled to the hall like a wave, shaking the walls, echoing off the high ceilings. Samuel sat there, stunned. He hadn't played for recognition. He hadn't played for applause. He had played because the music demanded to be played. And yet, here he was, receiving the kind of ovation most performers only dream of. The transformation complete. The transformation of the crowd was undeniable. They had entered the evening as people of wealth and status, laughing at the idea of a janitor daring to step into their world. But now, they were leaving performance as something else entirely, humbled, softened, changed. The music had peeled away their layers of arrogance and revealed something they thought they had lost: their humanity. And at the center of it all was Samuel, the man they once mocked, now standing taller than anyone else in the room. Samuel's quiet strength. As the applause roared on, Samuel bowed his head slightly, humbled. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to being seen. But in that moment, he realized something powerful. People hadn't just heard his music. They had felt it, and that was enough. He didn't need their applause to know he had given them something real. The respect shining in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. The janitor, no more. In that instant, Samuel was no longer defined by his uniform, his mop, or his broom. He wasn't just a janitor. To the crowd, to the CEO, and even himself, he was something more. He was proof that greatness doesn't come from titles or wealth. It comes from the courage to share your gift with the world. And the crowd, transformed by his music, would never forget it. The music flowed like a river, sometimes gentle and calm, sometimes fierce and crashing. Samuel's hands moved with grace and power, weaving together notes that seemed to pull invisible threads inside everyone in the hall. It was no longer just sound. It was memory. The young woman's lullabies. Near the back of the room sat a young woman, barely in her 20s, who had been the loudest in mocking Samuel earlier. She had giggled, nudged her friends, and whispered, This is going to be hilarious. But now she wasn't laughing. The melody Samuel played reminded her of something she hadn't thought of in years. When she was a little girl, her grandmother used to sing her to sleep with a soft tune. The way Samuel's right hand danced across the high keys carried the exact same tenderness, the same sense of safety. Her eyes blurred. She wasn't in the CEO's party anymore. She was back in her childhood room, tucked under a quilt, listening to her grandmother's voice. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. But there was no denying it. The janitor's music had reached her in a way she didn't expect. The tough manager's father. At the far side of the hall stood a middle-aged manager, arms crossed, known for his cold demeanor. His employees whispered about how ruthless he was, how nothing ever seemed to soften him. But tonight, Samuel's music cracked his armor. The deep resonance of the left hand reminded him of his father, a quiet man who had whistled the same tune every morning while making breakfast. The melody was different, but the rhythm, the warmth, it was the same feeling. The manager hadn't thought of his father in years. They had drifted apart before his passing, and the guilt had always stayed buried inside him. But now, as Samuel played, he could almost hear his father again, whistling and laughing in their small kitchen. His throat tightened. He clenched his jaw to keep his composure, but inside, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in decades: regret and love. The waiters forget their jobs. Even the staff, who usually stayed invisible during events like this, were drawn in. One young waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes found himself frozen in place, staring at Samuel. The music reminded him of home, of his mother who used to hum songs while she cooked dinner. He hadn't been home in years, too busy working double shifts to send money back. But now, he felt her presence so vividly, it was like she was right there with him. The tray in his hands trembled slightly. He lowered it carefully onto a nearby table and simply stood there, listening, tears welling in his eyes. For once, his job didn't matter. Only the music did. The guests rediscovered themselves. All across the hall, it was the same. Each guest, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, felt the music pulling something personal out of them. A woman in diamonds thought of her childhood piano lessons she had abandoned and the dream she never chased. A man in a tailored tuxedo thought of his first love, the one he let slip away because he was too afraid to fight for her. A group of investors, usually hard, calculating, and stone-faced, shifted uncomfortably as the music reminded them of a time when they weren't defined by money, but by innocence. For the first time in years, they felt vulnerable, human, the CEO's breaking point. And then there was Mr. Reynolds, the CEO. The music hit him hardest of all. He hadn't cried in public for decades, hadn't even allowed himself to feel weakness. But as Samuel played, the floodgates inside him burst. He saw his daughter, her small hands on the piano keys, her laughter filling their home. He remembered the way she begged him to sit and listen. Just one song, Daddy. Please. But he never did. He always had another meeting, another deal, another phone call. And then she was gone. Now, as Samuel played with that same childlike passion, Reynolds felt every ounce of guilt he had buried deep inside. It was as if his daughter's spirit was in the room again, calling out to him through Samuel's fingers. The powerful CEO, the man everyone feared, slowly lowered his face into his hand. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, tears streamed down his cheeks. A universal language. What Samuel was doing couldn't be explained by technical skill alone. Yes, his playing was masterful, but it was more than that. He wasn't performing. He wasn't showing off. He was speaking in a language older than words, one that every soul understands, the language of music. It didn't matter that he was a janitor. It didn't matter that he wore a jumpsuit instead of a tuxedo. In that moment, Samuel was the most important person in the room, because he was giving them something they couldn't buy with all their money: connection, the transformation. By now, the entire atmosphere of the hall had shifted completely. At the start of the evening, the guests laughed at the idea of a janitor playing piano. They had seen him as entertainment, a clown, someone beneath them. But now, they sat in silence, their hearts laid bare, their walls torn down. They weren't CEOs, managers, or millionaires anymore. They were children remembering lullabies, sons remembering fathers, parents remembering lost children. They were simply human. All because one man decided to sit at the piano and pour out his soul. The music is a mirror. Samuel still had his eyes closed, lost in his world. He had no idea of the transformation unfolding in front of him. He didn't see the tears, the trembling hands, the bowed heads. But in a way, he didn't need to, because music has a way of being a mirror. The feelings he poured into the piano were the same feelings now reflected back in every person listening. Joy, pain, love, loss, hope. And in that shared experience, something beautiful was happening. Memories come alive. For every single person in that hall, the music became a bridge between past and present. Memories came alive, not as faded photographs in their minds, but as vivid, living experiences they could almost touch. They weren't just hearing Samuel's story. They were hearing their own. And that was the true power of his music. The first note hung in the air like a secret. It was soft, almost fragile, but it carried a weight that no one in that grand hall expected. The sound spread out across the chandeliers, across the marble floors, across every heart in the room. Samuel's hands trembled for only a second, then steadied. His callous fingers, so used to gripping mops, buckets, and brooms, suddenly looked like they were born for the piano keys. And just like that, the janitor became someone else. A melody born from pain and love. The second note followed, then another, and soon a melody began to form. It wasn't a rigid, mechanical sound. It was alive. Each key carried emotion, sorrow, joy, hope, all woven together like threads of story. Samuel wasn't reading sheet music. He wasn't following rules. He was playing from memory, from heart, from the deepest part of his soul that had been locked away for decades. He remembered the nights in the jazz bar, when the crowd swayed to his rhythm. He remembered Mary sitting in the corner, smiling with her eyes closed, whispering later, "Samuel, you don't just play music, you make people feel." He remembered the lonely nights after she passed, when he sat by himself, letting the piano be the only voice that understood his pain. Now, all of it poured out into the hall. The crowd begins to shift. At first, people simply froze. They had expected chaos, noise, embarrassment. Instead, they were hearing something that felt too perfect, too emotional to be an accident. The whispers had died long ago. Now there was only stillness. A young woman near the back slowly lowered her phone, realizing she no longer wanted to watch through a screen. She wanted to experience it fully, with her own eyes, her own ears, her own heart. One of the managers, known for his arrogance and impatience, found himself leaning against the wall, his brow furrowed, not in judgment but in disbelief. How could a janitor play like this? Even the waiters, still holding trays, stopped walking altogether. Drinks sat untouched, food grew cold, and yet no one noticed. The room that once belonged to wealth and ego now belonged to Samuel. Notes that tell a story. The melody deepened. His right hand danced lightly on the high keys, while his left hand rumbled low, steady, like a heartbeat. It was as if two voices were speaking at once, one of sorrow, one of hope, intertwining in perfect harmony. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others simply stared wide-eyed, unable to look away. It wasn't just music anymore. It was storytelling. Each phrase spoke of struggles endured, of love lost, of nights when dreams seemed impossible. And yet, beneath all the pain, there was resilience. There was beauty. One guest whispered without realizing it, This is real music. The CEO's heart stirs. At the head of the hall, Mr. Reynolds, the CEO, sat completely still. He was a man known for his iron heart, for decisions made with logic, not emotion. But now his eyes softened, his chest heavy, because deep inside, the music was awakening a memory he had long buried. Years ago, his daughter, his little girl, had loved piano. She would sit in their home, tiny fingers barely reaching the keys, laughing when she hit the wrong notes. He remembered how she begged him to come listen, how she wanted to play at his birthday one year. But he was too busy, too distracted by deals, meetings, money. And then she was gone. A tragic accident took her far too soon. He had avoided pianos ever since. The sound was too painful. But now, Listening to Samuel, tears pricked the corners of his eyes. It felt like, for the first time in years, his daughter was in the room again. The music rises. Samuel's fingers move faster now, the melody swelling. The soft beginning gave way to power. The notes struck harder, richer, like waves crashing on the shore. The crowd gasped quietly at the shift. It was no longer just gentle storytelling. It was passion unleashed. One man in the front row gripped the edge of his chair, his heart racing with the rhythm. A woman beside him pressed her hand to her chest, as if the music had reached inside her and touched something fragile. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. Samuel's world. But Samuel wasn't thinking of them. He wasn't playing for an audience. He was back in his own world. He was 19 again, in that smoky jazz bar, feeling the energy of a crowd that loved him. He was 25 again, with Mary's hand resting on his shoulder as she whispered encouragement. He was 35, comforting his crying children by playing them soft lullabies after their mother's passing. Every note carried a lifetime. And in that moment, Samuel wasn't Janitor. He wasn't poor. He wasn't invisible. He was the man he was always meant to be, a musician. The audience falls silent. The transformation in the room was complete. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one moved. The silence was not empty but full of awe, full of emotion, full of something they couldn't quite explain. People who had mocked him moments ago now looked ashamed. People who thought they were untouchable by emotion now felt tears welling up. Even the young employee who started the cruel joke sat frozen, his glass of wine untouched, his face pale. He didn't feel smug anymore. He felt small, the power of the first notes. It had only been a few minutes since Samuel first touched the keys, but already the entire atmosphere of the hall had changed. This wasn't a party anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was a revelation. The janitor had walked into the spotlight as a joke, but his music, the first notes of his heart, had silenced an entire room of powerful people. And deep down, every single person in that hall knew this was just the beginning. Samuel's boots echoed softly on the marble floor as he walked toward the stage. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of the weight of every eye fixed on him. The room that had been filled with laughter and chatter just moments ago now buzzed with anticipation, like an audience before the curtain rises. The janitor was about to touch the piano. The anticipation. People whispered, not quietly enough, "This is going to be embarrassing. I'll bet he doesn't even know where Middle C is. Oh, this is too good. I need to film this." Phones came out. A few of the younger guests angled their cameras, ready to catch the moment of humiliation and post it online. Some chuckled, rubbing their hands as if they were about to witness a comedy act. The waiters, balancing trays of drinks, exchanged glances. Some looked uneasy, unlike the wealthy guests. They knew what it felt like to be mocked. They paused in their tracks, curiosity written on their faces. And then there was Mr. Reynolds, the CEO. He sat at the center table, his expression unreadable. His fingers tapped lightly against his glass, his sharp eyes fixed on Samuel. Unlike the others, he didn't smirk or laugh. He simply waited. The man on stage. Samuel climbed the small steps leading to the stage. His mop and bucket leaned silently against the wall behind him, as though even they were watching. The grand Steinway loomed before him, polished so perfectly that the chandeliers reflected off its black surface like stars. For Samuel, it wasn't just a piano. It was a reminder of everything he had once loved, everything he had lost, and everything he still carried inside. He pulled out the bench slowly and sat down. The laughter dulled to a murmur. His hands rested in his lap for a moment, rough and callous from years of scrubbing floors. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. He closed his eyes. A memory flashed before him, Mary's voice. "Your music heals, Samuel. Don't ever forget that." He inhaled deeply. The stillness. For a long moment, he didn't move. His fingers hovered above the keys, not touching them yet, as though he was reaching for something deeper than sound. The room held its breath. The crowd expected him to slam random keys, to stumble into a mess of wrong notes that would send them into hysterics. But there was something about his stillness that unsettled them. The smirks began to fade. The giggles grew faint. One by one, heads tilted, arms folded. Even the people holding up their phones lowered them slightly, as if their instincts told them this wasn't going to be a performance they expected. The silence was thick now, so thick you could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers, the distant clink of ice in someone's glass, even the soft creak of Samuel shifting his weight on the bench. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence before a storm, a whisper to the keys. Samuel leaned forward, almost like he was bowing his head in prayer. His lips moved, but only those closest to the stage could hear the faint words. "For you, Mary." Then, finally, he let his fingers fall onto the keys. The first note rang out, soft and fragile, echoing across the hall like a drop of water falling into a still pond. Nobody laughed. The change in the room. It wasn't what they expected. Not at all. Instead of chaos, instead of a clumsy mess, the sound that emerged was beautiful, gentle, honest. The whispers stopped. The smirks disappeared completely. The guests leaned forward, brows furrowing, not in ridicule but in confusion. How could a janitor play like that? One woman lowered her champagne glass slowly, her lips parting as if she had forgotten how to breathe. A manager in the back, arms crossed smugly just seconds ago, now unfolded them and took a step closer. Even the waiters stopped moving altogether, frozen in place, their trays hovering midair. The entire hall seemed to pause, eyes that began to see. People looked at Samuel differently now. They noticed the way his eyes stayed closed, as though he wasn't playing for them at all. He was playing for something greater. They noticed the way his body leaned into the music, not with the stiffness of a beginner, but with the fluid grace of someone who had lived inside melodies for years. The young employee who had started the joke swallowed hard. He had expected laughter, but what he got was something far more uncomfortable: shame. Even Mr. Reynolds, the CEO, shifted in his chair. His usual stoic expression cracked for the first time as he tilted his head, his sharp eyes softening. The hall transformed. The grand corporate hall, once a place of laughter and power games, was now transformed into something else entirely: a concert hall, a place where wealth, titles, and status no longer mattered. There was no noise, no arrogance, no ego. Just one man and his piano. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of anticipation, full of emotion, full of the unspoken realization spreading across every face. This man wasn't Janitor in this moment. He was a musician. The tension before the storm. As Samuel's fingers began to move with more confidence, layering the melody, the room seemed to tighten with energy. The air itself felt charged. No one dared speak. No one dared laugh. No one dared move too loudly. It was as though they all knew instinctively that they were on the edge of something unforgettable. The cameras came back up, not for ridicule this time, but because the people holding them realized this was a moment they wanted to remember. And in the center of it all sat Samuel, the janitor who had been invisible just minutes ago, commanding the room without a word, without a title, without wealth, only with music. The room goes silent. It was a kind of silence that artists dream of, the silence that means people are truly listening, not distracted, not amused, but completely surrendered to the moment. That silence, that reverence, belonged to Samuel now. And though he didn't know it yet, this silence was just the beginning. What was about to pour out of him, the music, the soul, the truth, would not only silence a room, but move it to tears. Most people in that glittering hall only saw a janitor. To them, Samuel was just another man in a gray jumpsuit, sweeping up crumbs, polishing floors, and scrubbing toilets. He was background noise, the kind of worker people stepped around without even saying thank you. But what they didn't know was that Samuel carried a story inside him far richer than any of their business empires. The boy who loved music. Samuel grew up in a small neighborhood where opportunities were few, but dreams were endless. His mother worked 2 jobs, his father passed away when he was only 9, and life was never easy. But there was one thing that made young Samuel's eyes light up every time he saw it: the piano in the old church down the street. It wasn't a fancy piano. It was chipped, missing a few keys, and always slightly out of tune. But to Samuel, it was magical. Every Sunday after service, while others ran outside to play, he would sneak to the piano, pressing keys, fascinated by the way each sound felt alive. One day, the church's old pianist noticed him. "Boy," the man chuckled, "you got fingers made for music." From then on, Samuel would sit for hours, learning chords, scales, and simple hymns. He didn't have formal training, but he had something better, raw passion. Soon, he could play by ear, turning simple notes into flowing melodies that made people stop and listen. By the time he was 16, Samuel wasn't just that boy from the neighborhood. He was a boy who could play. At weddings, at gatherings, even at the corner cafe, people asked him to play. And when he played, they smiled. He felt like he was giving them something the world desperately needed. Peace. Dreams of a future. As Samuel grew older, he dreamed bigger. Maybe, just maybe, he could become a professional musician. Maybe he could play in concert halls, record albums, or even teach others to find joy in music. At 19, he joined a small jazz band. They played in smoky bars and restaurants, anywhere that would let them set up. They didn't earn much, sometimes just a plate of food and a few dollars a split, but Samuel didn't care. He was doing what he loved. And then came Mary. She was a waitress at one of the cafes where his band performed. Samuel remembered the first time he saw her, how she leaned against the counter, listening with her eyes closed, swaying gently to his music. After the set, she walked up to him and said, "You don't just play notes, you play feelings." That was the beginning of a love story. They married a few years later, and for a while, life was beautiful. Samuel played piano at local gigs, and Mary encouraged him every step of the way. One day, she would whisper, "The world will know your music." Life strikes hard, but life is a way of testing even the strongest dreams. When their first child was born, bills started piling up. Samuel's gigs weren't steady enough to provide for a family. He took a job as a janitor, just for a while, to make ends meet. 1 year turned into 5. 5 turned into 10. Soon, the piano was less a part of his daily life and more a distant memory. His children grew, his responsibilities doubled, and music became something he played only late at night, when everyone else was asleep. Then came tragedy. Mary fell ill. Despite Samuel's efforts, her health declined rapidly, and one cold evening, she was gone. The love of his life, the woman who believed in his music more than anyone, was taken from him. That night, Samuel sat at the piano, playing through his tears. He whispered, "For you, Mary," and promised himself he'd keep her memory alive in his music. But the world had other plans. With 2 children to raise alone, Samuel had no choice but to work harder than ever. He took on extra shifts. The piano gathered dust. His music, the very thing that defined him, was locked away, hidden behind exhaustion and survival. The man they never saw. By the time Samuel reached middle age, most people only knew him as a janitor. They saw his gray jumpsuit, his tired eyes, his callous hands. They never saw the pianist who once dreamed of stages and spotlights. They never heard the melodies locked inside his heart. He didn't complain. He didn't boast. He worked quietly, humbly, always showing respect to everyone, even when they didn't show it to him. But deep down, he carried a weight, a secret part of him that still longed for the world to hear the music he kept buried. And so, as he sat on that stage at the CEO's party, looking at the grand piano, memories came flooding back. The church piano, the jazz bars, Mary's smile, the promise he made to her. That's why, when the guests laughed and mocked, Samuel didn't see a joke. He saw an opportunity. Maybe the only chance he'd ever get to show who he really was. They thought they were setting him up for humiliation. What they didn't know was that they had just opened the door to the part of Samuel the world had forgotten. The musician, not the janitor. So in the end, the joke was never on Samuel. It was on those who thought a man's worth could be measured by the broom in his hand. He showed them in the world that hidden inside the humblest places can be the brightest gifts. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. The next time you see someone overlooked, someone dismissed as just a janitor or just a worker, remember Samuel's story. Because greatness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a uniform and waits quietly for the right moment to shine. This was the story of the janitor who played the piano and made even a CEO cry.